Okay, we're going to be talking now about something called completing the square. But before we do that, we need to introduce a property to you. So let's go into this slowly. Let's talk about what we already know, and then we'll apply that to this new concept. Okay, we have talked about quadratic equations before in a previous chapter. Remember that a quadratic is anything that comes in the form of something x squared plus something x plus a constant, a single term. Okay, so generally, you're going to recognize these because the highest power of x is a square. We sometimes call these square equations or quadratic equations. Okay, we saw stuff like this before, but whenever we saw it before, it looked something like this. So let's kind of do a quick review to remember how we would work a problem that looked like this. If you'll remember, every time that you see something that has a squared as the highest power of x, then probably what should be going through our mind is, I wonder if this will factor, because we worked extensively on factoring with these quadratic equations. So let's see if we try to factor this. Since it's a trinomial, 3 terms, and the first coefficient is a 1, hopefully we can just break it down into the binomials. So let's see, x times x would give us x squared, and we have to think of how to break up 3 so that we get a positive 2. Well, that would happen if we said plus 3 minus 1, because multiplying those would give you the negative 3, and combining those would give you the positive 2. So this is how this factors. Then, if you'll remember, we had a property that was called the zero product property. And that said, if you've got two things that multiply together to get 0, then one or both of them have to be 0. So that means that x plus 3 has to equal 0, or x minus 1 has to equal 0. And then we can solve each one of these mini equations. So either x is negative 3 or x is positive 1. So we had two solutions to this problem, negative 3 and 1. All right. Now, we also worked something that looked like this. X squared minus 4 equals 0. And again, this will factor because it's a quadratic. This is a difference of two squares, if you remember that term. So this would factor into x plus 2, x minus 2. That way our middle term cancels out, and the last terms give us the negative 4. And again, then we would use that zero product property to say x plus 2 equals 0 or x minus 2 equals 0. And solving each one, we would get x equals negative 2 or x equals positive 2. So we have solutions of negative 2 and positive 2. Okay, in the last chapter, we talked about square roots. Now that we have some understanding about square roots, we can take this exact same problem and we can solve it by using what's called the square root property. And in the square root property, let's move this 4 over to the other side first. Now this will only work with, when we just have two terms in a quadratic. So make that important note also. So if I move my 4 over to the other side by adding 4, now we have x squared equals 4. And because we know about square roots, we can take the square root in order to undo that square. So x will have to equal the square root of 4, which is plus or minus 2. So in this case, now we have our answers, or our solutions, are a negative 2 and a positive 2. The exact same thing we got by factoring, we can do with the square root property.